Rohi, 50-50.
Professor Roy Chaudhary is starting another 3 or 4 minutes.
Yes, sir. We will start by say 7:05 in 3 minutes.
আরো 3-4 মিনিট লাগবে।
So we maybe start. We have put the meeting on record.
Okay. Right. Yes. Professor Roy Chaudhary, can we start now then?
Sure, sir. We are good to go.
Right. Okay. I'll just make just a few words as introduction, not really as introduction, but as a as a kind of a startup. We are very, very happy and proud that we have a professor of the stature of Professor Sobha Chatterjee addressing us this night. And thank you so much, Shobhadi. She is, among many other things, she is a specialist on American literature, and we are waiting to hear from her on her topic today. Now, without further ado, let me hand over the proceedings to our head of the department, Professor Dr. Probal Roy Chaudhary, and to my assistant, Professor Munikinkini Pasu. First of all, Professor Probal Roy Chaudhary, head of the Department of English, Sister Nivedita University. Dr. Roy Chaudhary, all yours.
Thank you, Professor Dhar. A very warm welcome and a good evening to Professor Chattopadhyay. Thank you so much for joining us. And we do this monthly program, Saturday with a Scholar, where every month we invite a very senior scholar to, I won't say to speak on always on a specific topic, but to share her lifelong experience or association with the subject with our students. We also have participations outside of Sister Nivedita University and our department, and that makes it a very happy occasion for us and makes the Saturday evening so special. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. And I would like to formally introduce you before our audience. Professor Sobha Chatterjee has been associated with the Department of English at Jadavpur University for more than last 4 decades. She was the head of the Department of English at Jadavpur between 2001 and 2003. Her PhD dissertation was on Graham Greene in the 1980s. He has also edited Jadavpur University's Essays and Studies, Volume 16 in 2002, and also the Many Worlds of 20th Century Literature, published by Papyrus from Kolkata in 2018. He has published articles on Graham Greene, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, William Golding, Walter Scott, Wordsworth, Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Amitav Ghosh, Noipal, Sarojini Naidu, R.K. Narayan. She has written on Dalit literature, on partition literature, and this intergamut of publication has been in as many as 30 national and international journals and books. She has also presented papers in more than 30 international conferences, both in India and abroad, and in many national and other seminars. She has also delivered about 40 lectures in refresher courses in several universities across India. And in 2009, she delivered invited lectures at the University of California at Berkeley, at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and also at Colorado College, all in the United States. She has guided and supervised about 20 PhD dissertations and 35 MPhil dissertations. That's a long list, ma'am, and we are extremely happy, we are delighted, we are privileged that you are with us here today, and now we would like to hear from you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Ma'am, I'll just unmute you, ma'am. One minute. You have to unmute yourself, ma'am.
Is it okay now?
Is it okay now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfectly fine.
Fine. Well, I'm very bad at technology. And anyway, as promised, I am going to talk about the Black American fiction today. The time available is more or less 1 hour. So it's a huge area, and it's difficult to cover such a big area within 1 hour. So I might sound a little sketchy, but I try to abbreviate things and do it within time. A proper assessment of Black American fiction of the 20th century needs a dip into the past. Where should one begin? I thought of starting with the slave trade and all that, but I think I will come to that later after I've talked about literature. To come to the 20th century, the great migration, I feel, is a very important starting point, and so is the Negro Renaissance of the 20s. These two can be taken as the starting point. The great migration, I feel, is the most important event in the history of the American Negro since his emancipation from slavery. It was not a movement of the colored population from south to north, country to city, expansion of industry and labor market meant urbanization of the American Negro. It raised his standard of living, gave him better educational opportunities, fostered a new attitude of self-respect and independence. It lifted him to a new plane of consciousness. New group experience called for a new literary movement to interpret it. You've all heard about Harlem, and Harlem, the literary, musical, theatrical capital of America, the seat of the largest Negro community in the world, became the center of this new movement. Harlem also meant proximity to Broadway, little magazines, publishing houses, Greenwich Village, and the avant-garde literary groups. Harlem became the cultural center of Negro America and Negro Renaissance. Actually, it represented the Negro's impulse towards cultural autonomy, sense of self-discovery, and sudden growth in things Negro. After the disillusionment with the values of the white majority in the wake of the First World War, there was a kind of withdrawal of allegiance on the part of the Negro intelligentsia from the values of the dominant culture towards alternative values, their own tradition, and the thought of preserving their own identity and individuality, their own folklore, folk culture, and primitivism. The trend is visible in the Harlem School of Novelists. I start with the Harlem School of Novelists. These are not well-known names. For example, Claude Mackay, Banana Bottom, 1933, Langston Hughes. Most of you have heard about Langston Hughes and his poetry, but he had a novel, Not Without Laughter, 1930, and Jean Toomer's Cain, 1923. These novels must be seen as distinct from earlier Black novels, and I give one example, James Weldon Johnson's An Autobiography of a Colored Man, 1912. Johnson's autobiography is very different. His Black protagonist being modeled on white culture heroes. In the next phase, in the turbulent 1930s and 40s, I'm moving on from the 20s. I started from the 20s and Harlem Renaissance. Now we move to the 30s and 40s. With the Great Depression, we have to understand the lean and hungry 30s. The collapse of the entire economic system giving rise to a new social consciousness. Grievance leading to new movements. Excuse me. And class consciousness above all. New race consciousness and class consciousness. There is a greater emphasis now on social realism. Novelists conscious of the literary possibilities of cane fields and cotton plantations. Here I have to name Richard Wright. His famous novel, Native Son, 1940. It's the He's one of the best novelists of the period, dealing with the ghetto life in the metropolis of Chicago. The novel is set in Chicago. His association with communism and socialism made him take an environmental view of crime as a natural and inevitable product of the war-fed society. He depicts a criminal career of Bigger Thomas, that is the name of the protagonist, a story of gruesome crime, murder, flight, capture, and trial. Emerging from the meaninglessness of his previous existence, Bigger achieves fulfillment through murder and violent defiance. His environment, an unjust society, has made him a rebel, incapable of relating meaningfully with other human beings, except through journals. Accumulated grievances, city life also provided novelists, and journals provided novelists with materials. They had a naturalistic respect for objective details. Coming down to the end of 40s and 50s, since the Negro received now a fuller share of the national life, there was improvement in society. The Black novel diverted from protest towards other directions, into new and unfamiliar channels. The direction is towards a more universal art, quote and unquote, approaching the Negro as a human being. An important Black novelist of the 50s is James Baldwin, quite an important writer. His early novels are an expression of rage and about quest for identity. But his best novel is called Go Tell It on the Mountain. This came out in 1953. Is about religious conversion of an adolescent boy, bringing out the terror of the ghetto child, the fear of evil, and the power of the white. In fact, if we look at the history of the Black novel so far, it has been moving between protest and assimilation. Ralph Ellison's, now we come to the best Afro-American novel, Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, 1953, is one of the greatest Black novels ever written in America. In 1965, Ellison speaks for the rejection of protest fiction as a literary mode. His symbolic treatment of race in this novel seems to offer a viable alternative. The Negro's invisibility is enlarged to encompass the central dilemma of modern man. He treats the protagonist as a human being, first of all. the full complex ambiguity of the human being. And he treats the protagonist thus, and he moves towards a more universal art. Ellison was influenced by modernists like Eliot, Joyce, and Hemingway. In this novel, Ellison reveals a deep understanding of Dostoevsky's novella, Notes from Underground. The way Ellison mixes the realistic and the symbolic levels. Actually, I would say the way he uses rituals, folklore, irony, myths, and symbols. Symbols like that of sight or vision, or the symbol of the eye. And he also introduces jazz and blues. All this adds richness to the novel's texture and increase its resonance. It's a great novel. But then, what is the picture like? This is the 50s we're talking about. What is the picture like in the 60s and 70s? Black consciousness took an increasingly nationalist turn after 1963. There is Malcolm X's assertion of independent cultural identity and rejection of everything Western and white. They take an extremely utilitarian view of literature and advocate politicized art. You're talking about the 60s. You have Baraka, Eldridge, and others calling for independent publishing houses and castigating assimilationist trends. This is a period when you have a novel like Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, which reaches near perfection through form and content. Another novel of the 60s I particularly want to mention is Yellow Black Radio Broke Down. It illustrates, this is by Ismail Reed, it illustrates refined use of the clash between different cultures. However, high protest content is not likely to produce good fiction. Extremist views on both sides seem absurd. In the midst of all these controversies, I feel Ellison's symbolic treatment of race in Invisible Man seems to offer a viable alternative. Now I'm moving to another part of my lecture. This discussion would be incomplete without a reference to African American women's novels. I shall be now concentrating mainly on a few women novelists. I'll take up Jean Toomer's Cain, 1923, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, Paul Marshall's Brown Girl, Brown Stones, that's in 1959. The other two were in the 30s. And of course, some of Toni Morrison's novels. And also, finally, end with Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Toomer delineates Southern Black peasant life, sketches 6 Southern women, showing a deep psychological insight into the working of woman's mind. Cain is a world of women, close to the roots of Southern soil, now transplanted to American soil, dramatically uprooted, traumatized by the conflict between subconscious physical urges and their conscious conformity to social conventions. We see the acute suffering of a Jewish father and a Negro mother. These vulnerable women, I was talking about the 6 women characters, they are doubly victimized as Black and as women. They are victims of the rigid system of racial segregation. Toomer's emphasis is on the importance of liberating these women from the restrictions imposed by society, depicting their journey to discover their American Black identity. Now I come to Zora Neale Hurston. She's the most significant African-American woman novelist of the post-Harlem Renaissance period. She's actually a product of the Harlem Renaissance. The theme is a conflict between the heroine Jani's romantic dream of love and fulfillment and the conventions of a male-dominated society frustrating woman's vision. The novel starts from the woman's point of view. Now, that way Hurston is very innovative. Henry James actually had shown us earlier the use of point of view. And actually Hurston also starts with the woman's point of view. The woman is Jani, the Black woman, and the central character, returning to Eastonville after years, narrating her past to her close friend Phoebe. In the second chapter, we move to Jani's grandmother, Nani, her point of view. Nani standing for the sexual exploitation of the Negro women, warning Jani against domination and exploitation, touching on race and gender. I remember a very important line from Nani's speech. The nigger woman is the mule of the world, as I can see. Nani here stands for the common nigger woman. Her views contrasted with those of Jani. The author's sympathy being more with Jani, her rejection of social codes. and family wishes in pursuit of love and adventure. Nani, born in slavery, had to sacrifice her own dreams, passing on her dreams of security to the next generation. Younger women like Jenny can never understand the sacrifice Nani underwent to provide better life for them. Jenny finds present life unexciting, boring, and unfulfilling, fed up with the business instincts of her two husbands. She at last decides to rebel against social conventions and sees herself, as she calls, a pear tree. Actually, she finds ultimately happiness with her third husband, Tea Cake, an incarnation of folk culture, a hedonist enjoying life to the fullest. The novel is a tribute to self-assertion and Black womanhood, a life of spiritual and physical fulfillment. The three other Black novelists I've chosen are from a later period. Paul Marshall, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker. Many things had happened during this period. These novelists are all associated with Black Power movement, Black arts movement, a call for Black people in the country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. And also with the women's rights movement. They spoke directly to the aspirations and needs of Black America. Black women struggle together with Black men against racism, but they struggle with Black men against sexism. Here is Paul Marshall remarking about the Black woman movement in an interview in 1979. Quote, "I want them to be central characters. Women in fiction seldom are. My feminism takes its expression through my work." Unquote. Marshall's Rena, the name of the novel is Rena, and Rena being a central character, is woman-centered, written from the point of view of a middle-aged woman, Rena. Rena could have been an older Selina, the protagonist of Marshall's famous novel, Brown Girl, Brown Stones. The quiet Selina is caught between the rigid codes of Barbados community, her mother's need for security, and her father's proud manhood. A marginal woman growing up in Brooklyn starts as a girl. She's growing up in Brooklyn, New York, the daughter of Black immigrants from the Caribbean island of Barbados. torn to pieces by the conflict between her mother, Sheila's determination to acquire ownership of the brownstone house in New York, and her father's refusal to sell his old property in Barbados. Selina, the brown girl, gradually, in course of the novel, develops into an intelligent, complex woman. All this does not rob Selina of her capacity for love and compassion, moving towards an understanding of herself, her culture, and the wider society. Marshall's last novel, Praising for the Widow, 1983, is written again from the point of view of a 62-year-old widow about her regeneration. This discussion would remain incomplete without the mention of the first Black American woman novelist to earn the Nobel Prize, Toni Morrison. This famous Black novelist's first novel is The Bluest Eye, 1971. Set in Ohio, 1941, it is the story of a small brown girl, Pecola. The subject of the novel is racism, a practice that is still continuing in America in one form or other. Pecola suffers from inferiority complex, for her neighbors consider her ugly, quote unquote, because of her dark skin and mannerisms. Soon she becomes a victim of rape. Her premature baby dies. Her only aspiration or dream lies in her desire for the bluest eyes. Bluest eyes seems to be a symbol of the white girl's beauty. In such a society where she would never find happiness or be beautiful, her only way of escape is insanity or madness. The whole novel actually shows how the community has used her. It is a very dismal picture. In 1973, Sula brought Morrison her Nobel Prize. Here, the novel has vividly depicted the gruesome experience, sufferings, and trauma of middle-class Black young ladies. Here she shows the struggle for Black women's identity. How violence of race and gender and class has poisoned their life. The theme of Beloved is all the same. How social injustice and exploitation has destroyed the Black slaves and the Black community itself, especially slaves. The heroine Sete is a slave who has been living in her house with her 18-year-old daughter. But it is a haunted house. The house is haunted by her dead daughter's spirit. As a result, Sete's two sons have run away from the house. She soon finds a woman sleeping near her doorsteps. The woman calls herself Beloved. Neighbors feel that this woman is the embodied spirit of her dead daughter. The novel shows the development of a close attachment or bondage between Sete and Beloved. Beloved shows the all-encompassing destruction wrought by slavery. Last we end with Alice Walker, the leader of the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. She attempts a womanist subject matter, the way women perceive the world. Walker tells in an interviewer, quote, "I'm committed to exploring the oppressions, the insanities, the loyalties, and the triumphs of Black women." Again, quote, "To me, the Black women are the most fascinating creations of the world." They are the most fascinating creations. We remember in poetry also, Black is beautiful, that slogan comes back again and again. In the poems of Sonia Sache's, Nikki Giovanni, the color purple is the name, I'll only take one novel, she has other novels, is the novel that I shall be talking about. It's in epistolary form from the point of view of two sisters, Celie and Nettie. Like Morrison's Pecola, Celie actually has earned the epithet ugly. Celie records the details of her life, extreme exploitation and oppression inflicted on her as a race, both racial and sexual, raped by her stepfather. Also, it is about the resistance put up by her. Nettie has seen similar subordination of women in Africa. However, toward the end, there is a regeneration of character, self-realization, and a journey towards triumph, shattering the facade of hypocrisy surrounding patriarchy. The novel is a collage and reworking of the legendary life of Walker's own grandmother. Raped at 12 by her slave-holding master. The novel ends with the triumph and waking of the protagonist's consciousness, a belief in women's power and sisterhood. Alice Walker's novel is more optimistic that way, ends with belief in sisterhood and woman's power. Now, this is all about literature. I've decided to abbreviate it and put it in this shape, but I'll end up now with a bit of history. of the Black people. The history of Black people in the US falls into two phases. The early phase covers pre-Civil War to post-Civil War period. The era of slavery followed by the era of emancipation and Reconstruction. Slavery gradually being replaced by equally oppressive social stigma of racism. Actually, 20th century people of African origin were called first Negroes. Consciousness, actually, even by themselves, they were called Negroes, and Negro means black in Spanish and Portuguese. But with the rise of community consciousness, the less offensive designation, colored people, came into existence. The next stage occurred in late 1950s and 60s after the Black Power movement promoted by Black Panther Party, nonviolent campaign for full civil rights made by Martin Luther King, culminating in Civil Rights Act, voting rights in 1965. As I said, Black is beautiful was the word, and somehow Negro and colored seemed politically incorrect. And of course, Black is a sign of proudly assertive racial identity. But Jackson used another coinage, African American. Jackson used it with a hyphen, but later it is used without a hyphen, or the term Afro-American. The main point being that why should it be hyphenated? Because Americans are called Americans, never German Americans or Dutch Americans. I will now talk a few minutes about the Middle Passage, the journey to America, the slave's journey. From the 15th to well into the 19th century, ships engaged in the Atlantic slave trade sailed from Western European countries like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, carrying manufactured goods to the West African countries. And the payment was in slaves. European or Arab slave traders sold the slaves, or African rulers themselves sold the slaves. The slavers or slave ships then sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas, initially to Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South America, and later in the mid-17th century to the plantation colonies of the American South. Actually, they exchanged agricultural produce like cotton, rice, tobacco, and indigo. The second or middle leg of this triangular journey from West Africa to America came to be known as the infamous Middle Passage. Incidentally, Phyllis Wheatley, the poet, I used to teach Wheatley once, was transported as a 7-year-old to become a housemaid with a northern white family. She was converted and educated, and later wrote poetry herself. But life was much harsher, hellish for the plantation slaves in American South. The voyage took over 6 months. They were fed on 1 meal a day. The horrors of the Middle Passage are described in Toni Morrison's Beloved, and also the trauma came out in Charles R. Johnson's novel Middle Passage, 1990. The first ship to carry Africans to North America, a Dutch slaver, arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Chattel slavery was absolute ownership of slaves. Chattels are objects with no human rights. That became legal in American South. Slaves were property of the owners, and their offsprings too were property of the owners. The slave holdings increased through procreation. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom, and his master relocated him from a slave state to a free state. But still there were problems, because the slave, when released, was in a desperate position, because the slave didn't know where to go, how to find a job. So rehabilitation should come with emancipation. And the belief altogether among white Americans was that slaves were far inferior to the whites in every way. But I would say that the slaves, after they were liberated by Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863, were actually taken care of, and Lincoln started promoting education and job skills. The one man who was against emancipation was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson defranchised African Americans in 1913, legalized racial discrimination. This system is something like the Indian caste system. And Ambedkar, doing his PhD in economics in Columbia University in New York between 1913 and 1916, was inspired and came back to India to rescue the Dalits the one man who led the movement for Negroes was Booker Washington from 1890 till his death. In southern state of Alabama, batches of polytechnic students came out, and Black students got admission there. And in 1898, Washington initiated the National African American Council, NAAC. His autobiography is very interesting, Up from Slavery in 1901. Another activist who led the movement was Dubois, W.E.B. Dubois. Washington and Dubois gave a voice to the voiceless. And Black literary and cultural nationalist movement known as Harlem Renaissance was a result of their effort. Racism, however, was not dead. 1909 saw the formation of National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which is active even today. In 1954, a landmark year, segregation in primary schools became unconstitutional. I end up with Martin Luther King, who joined NAACP in Alabama and took up the Gandhian program of peaceful civil disobedience. We all know the story, how the Black woman Rosa Parks refused to vacate a bus seat for a white passenger and was arrested and fined. And Luther's movement started there. Of course, racism is still raging, difficult to actually abolish it. President Kennedy actually had to die, assassinated on November 22, to send a civil rights bill to the US Congress. That was not embraced by all. His successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, did pass pro-Black laws and permitted African Americans to reside in white neighborhoods. This was a great advancement. Earlier, they were not allowed to live in the same neighborhood where whites lived. And NAACP is continuing its great fight for civil rights. And it enabled election in 2009, America's first African-American president, Barack Obama, was a result of NAACP's work. I think it's quite long. I should end here. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Sohadi, it wasn't too long. In fact, it was an amazing lecture because you managed to put in so much into such a short time, less than 1 hour. I don't think anybody...
Thank you, but I tried hard to compress it and put it there, all of it. Well,
Professor Chaudhary, would you like to take over now?
Yeah, ma'am, thank you for the wonderful, I would say, the way you covered the entire gamut. And
I tried to somehow.
So it's always a pleasure to listening to a senior scholar like you, and we get to learn so much from you.